We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. So if you want to give us a little love in that department, go to skeptic.com/donate. All right. My guest today is Nathan Law. He's a young Hong Kong activist, currently in exile and based in London. During the Umbrella Movement in 2014, Nathan was one of 5 representatives who took part in the dialogue with the government, debating political reform, upholding nonviolent civic actions. Nathan, Joshua Wong, and other student leaders founded democracies in 2016 and ran for the Legislative Council election. Nathan was elected with 50,818 votes in the Hong Kong Island constituency and became the youngest legislative councillor in history. Wow. Yet his seat was overturned in July 2017 following Beijing's constitutional reinterpretation despite international criticism. Nathan was later jailed for his participation in the Umbrella Movement. Persecution sparked global concern over Beijing's crackdown on human rights and democratic movement in Hong Kong. And in 2018, Nathan and his fellow student activists, Joshua Wong and Alex Cho, were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by U.S. congressmen and British Parliament members. Due to the risk imposed by the draconian national security law, Nathan left Hong Kong and continues to speak up for Hong Kong people on an international level. In 2020, he was listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. And he's the author of the new book, Freedom, How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. I don't have a copy of the book, but here's the audio edition. Well, you can't see that very well, but in any case, I listened to it 1.5 times. I listened to the first couple chapters again yesterday and this morning. And we met in Tucson, Arizona a couple weeks ago at the Dialogue. So nice to see you, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Michael, and a very warm introduction of me.
So you're in London. Okay, you're in exile. Maybe we could start with a brief history of Hong Kong. Just kind of give us the big picture. I mean, these man in the street interviews where people can't point to the country they're experts on the map and so on. Where is Hong Kong? How's this different from Taiwan? And what's the history of it with England, with the UK and all that stuff?
Hong Kong has been well known for its competence as an international financial center. It is being compared to London, to New York, and it is a vibrant and energetic city. So I grew up in Hong Kong, and we all know that Hong Kong has been in a great position of being one of the most vibrant and, really the city that attracts talent and capital. And I think that is the impression for a lot of people around the world as well. Hong Kong used to be a British colony. British had its ruling in Hong Kong for more than 115 years. Until 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government. Everyone was quite nervous because back then the Chinese government was still quite against capitalism. They were still very planned economy, very socialism in their own ways. And for those people who were in Hong Kong, who was already well established as a really capitalistic financial center, people were worried that whether their system would be overrun in a day or two. So in 80s, in 90s, approaching to the handover in 1997, there were waves of immigration out of Hong Kong. They went to Canada, went to the US, went to the UK, etc. But after that, there had been a period of time where the Beijing government gave Hong Kong lots of autonomy. So we ran our city, we ran our system, even though we have never elected our city's leader. But in the recent decades, in 2013, 2014, when Xi Jinping came into power, they changed the policy. They were being much more intervention. There were much more draconian measures applied to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong used to be a much more autonomous region, but for now it is basically being subsumed into just become an ordinary Chinese city. So that is the brief background of Hong Kong, and the political crackdown now is severe. We lost our freedom of speech, lots of our political freedoms, and there have been a lot of political prisoners and people like me who have to go into exile in order to just speak and just live.
Yeah, well, you're very brave to do that, considering the consequences if you went back. When it was a British colony, was it largely governed by its own constitution or under British rule, or how did that work?
So there's been lots of changes when it was a British colony. So in the mid of 19th century, when the British Empire found Hong Kong, basically they saw it as a colonial outpost, and then they tried to get it to be a spot where they can easily import things to China and to the rest of Southeast Asia. And gradually, when the British Empire built up Hong Kong's economy, it gradually turns it from a fishing village to really a city with a lot of talents and commercial people, and people very entrepreneurial right there. And then at the 2 to 3 decades approaching to the handover, which is 90s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there have been a lot more voice about Hong Kong people trying to get up in position to decide the operation of the city. Basically, they were fighting for political power. They were fighting for freedom of speech, right to elect their leaders. So gradually, the idea of civil society and democratic movement emerged in the 60s, 70s, 90s. And then in the last few terms of elections in Hong Kong, it became much more democratic. There were a significant amount of seats that were through direct elections. And the last election of the British colony was actually the most democratically produced ever. It is much more democratically elected than the one that we have now after Beijing fully taking control of Hong Kong and then conduct a lot of political overhaul.
Yeah. I just happened to have here, because I had a guest talking about this, the Constitution of the United States, a little booklet right here. Because in your book, you constantly refer to, the violations of your constitutional rights. So Hong Kong has something like this on the books that China, the People's Republic of China, is actually violating?
We didn't have quite similar of that in the colonial period, but we have, after the handover under the one country, two system governing framework, we have the mini constitution basic law, which was made in accordance to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was a treaty governing the handover of Hong Kong, governing the future of Hong Kong after 1997. So in the basic law, there are articles clearly stated that Hong Kong people should enjoy its freedom, enjoy its rule of law, and a gradual process to democracy. So there have been a lot of political movement in Hong Kong fighting for democracy, and we are not asking things that Beijing have not promised to us. We're not asking too much. We are just asking Beijing to honor its words that's written in the mini constitution, and then to give us democracy.
So these would be freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to assemble. Largely. Yeah,
there are lots of freedoms that are written in the Articles of Hong Kong, but sadly, many of them have been stripped away.
Right. Okay, let's talk about you personally a little bit. Your parents, I guess, immigrated to Hong Kong long before you were born. This is what, the 1950s and 60s? And then you came on the scene just before the handoff, I guess, right? You're 31, something like that. Okay, so
yeah,
right. So you kind of lived right in the middle of all this. It's incredible. What was their experience before and then in Hong Kong, and how did they pass on some of those values to you?
The story of mine and my father, I would say that is a sarcastic chapter of Hong Kong's history. So my father, he smuggled to Hong Kong from mainland China in the late 70s, when there was a policy in Hong Kong, actually. Even if you came to Hong Kong illegally, if you can escape from the border control and then safely arrive to the city center, the Hong Kong government will give you a permit to work and residency. So that was kind of like a population policies that attract people from mainland China to Hong Kong, and also screen out some of those who are not as competitive or not as fit. So that was a time when there were so many Chinese people who ran away and then tried to get into Hong Kong, because back then there was so much political and economic upheaval in mainland China. And in my father's village, there were no food to eat, basically. He was in his 20s, and the only hope was to escape to Hong Kong. So trying to get to Hong Kong was the most popular subject and topic in his village. And he managed to do it through taking a 3-day raft boat trip, which the sails of the boat was made out of their bed sheet. And then they barely had any food to eat on the boat. And then they landed into Hong Kong. He managed to get into the city center. And he was really lucky because he told me that he saw lots of floating bodies on the sea. And many of these figures were not documented because basically it was not available. There were no statistics of it. But thousands, tens of thousands of people, they died while trying to get to Hong Kong. And on the first day of him working as a construction worker, he earned more than a year of salary than himself working in mainland China. So that was the stark difference of Hong Kong to mainland China in the late 70s. And fast forward a few decades later, when my father saw this Hong Kong as a city of refuge, I became a refugee because of Hong Kong's political crackdowns. And when people saw Hong Kong as a city of hope, but for now is driving people hopeless. And then I, a son of a person who sought refuge in Hong Kong, had to flee and then to land in London and became a refugee and probably unable to go back to Hong Kong as long as the Beijing government is in power. So I would say that is a really sarcastic chapter in it. Hong Kong turned from a city of hope to a city which produced refugees.
Yeah. Well, that's an incredible story. I mean, the parallels to current immigration issues, people want to come to America because of economic opportunities from these countries where they don't have freedom and economic opportunity. That's inspirational. And if you can make it, well, at least until recently, maybe, if you make it out of the border control down in the southern border and make it into the cities away from the border, you're probably in. Now, when you were born in Hong Kong, so you are a citizen because you were born there versus your father is an immigrant, or how did that work?
So I was born in mainland China as well. And then I came to Hong Kong with my mother when I was 6.
I see.
So,
okay.
Yeah, I was also kind of like immigrants, but I would consider myself Hong Kong. I grew up in Hong Kong, and then I received my education in Hong Kong.
What's the ocean gap there between the mainland and in Hong Kong?
Oh, it's just a tiny one. It's just one bridge.
Okay.
So basically, the Hong Kong and mainland China, the bordering cities, Shenzhen, and they are just like close together.
But you mentioned your father taking a raft. That must have been from some other far north or something like that.
Yeah. So there were a lot of coastal city in south of Guangdong, south of China. And then there were many routes because there were also police patrolling. There were also safe routes and dangerous routes. Depends on the equipment that you have or how much risk you want to take. So he started somewhere definitely not the closest to Hong Kong.
Yeah. What are the principles behind the success of Hong Kong? I mean, besides the freedoms you mentioned, speech and assembly and press and so on, what are some of the economic policies that we could take as a lesson for how the world works? I mean, property rights or freedom to exchange goods and services, or what?
Yeah, that's a good question, even though I'm not an economist, but I can share some of my observations. So first of all, geography is really important. Hong Kong is well located here. You can pretty much take a transit flight in Hong Kong and to be in any Asian cities in just hours. So they are in a really good position, and also they have a very good harbor, which they can do a lot of shippings and things like this. Secondly, I think it is also because Hong Kong has always been somewhere people consider as close to mainland China, but not part of mainland China and facing to the world. Hong Kong has always been seen as a gateway into mainland China, and that was also initially the purpose of Hong Kong being a colonial outpost of the British Empire. It is because they wanted to get things into mainland China. Hong Kong has always been positioned in between two worlds, in between two cultures, and in between places where, well, a lot of things can happen, and Hong Kong can be the super connector. So that has been Hong Kong's role for many, many years, catching up with the rise of China, but also using its experience dealing with the world to help the region. But the problem is, for now, Hong Kong has lost its capacity as a super connector because it is too outright being owned by China. There was a level of independence and autonomy that made Hong Kong, that made Hong Kong so cosmopolitan, so transitional, so much flexibility and so much vision that it has. But if you are acting like the Chinese Communist Party now, which is putting Hong Kong into its pocket to suffocate its flow of talent and its vision, and the ambiguity it employed before so that it can move from one power to another, I think it just killed Hong Kong. The beauty of Hong Kong was it was actually not that part of China where China controls everything. And if it lost its uniqueness, the nebulous term, then it's pretty much done.
Did the Hong Kong people have that before the British colonialists came, or was some of that imported? Just some of that autonomy, individuality, entrepreneurship, trade, property rights, all those things that the British brought with them, presumably. Is that all new, or are the Hong Kong people different anyway from mainland Chinese people?
As far as I remember, before the British Empire came, Hong Kong was a fishing village with 3,000 people. It wasn't big. It wasn't entrepreneurial at all. And the British brought a lot of things. And then the ending decades of its colonial ruling, they specifically built Hong Kong, equipped Hong Kong with its economic power because they also wanted to let Hong Kong people to have more capitals when the Chinese government came, and then they have certain kind of importance to the government so that the Chinese government had incentive to keep Hong Kong as it was. So that was pretty much a lot of effort by, of course, Hong Kong people, but also part of the British administration. And I understand that colonial history is complicated, is complex. In general, it's brutal, is terrible. But there's another kind of colonial history of Hong Kong where there were actually a lot of legacy left. People consider it beneficial, and it's definitely having a different outlook than many of the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what's behind my question. Really, is colonialism and then decolonialism as its antithesis is now the thing. And it would be like saying, is there something good about slavery? I mean, that's about on par with asking about colonialism. But in fact, can we at least say one cheer, maybe not two or three cheers for colonialism, but maybe one cheer? We wouldn't want to do it again. It's never going to be repeated. But that it happened, it wasn't 100% bad. Something like that.
Well, I would say that Hong Kong people have never had any power to self-determine. We've fought for the right of self-determination. As a colony, we should have enjoyed the power of self-determination as listed in the Treaty of United Nations, but it was stripped away by a very sneaky effort from the Chinese government in the 60s or 70s. So we actually have never had the power to make our own choices about the future of the city. So that's definitely bad for us. But that's not only the fault of the colonial government. That's also intentionally made by the Chinese government because of what we're facing now, all these political crackdowns. Hong Kong is doing worse and worse in terms of economy and other performance, there are actually a chunk of Hong Kong people also feeling like if the Chinese government is an invasive force, they came in and tried to erase our culture, try to eradicate our political life, and trying to destroy the social fabrics of Hong Kong, they could probably be similar to another colonial power coming in a more brutal way. So I think that there has been a interesting phenomenon of some Hong Kong people who actually think that the governance that we have is worse than the last decade of the British colonial ruling, which we are not trying to praise colonialism, but there are other forms of governance that are worse than colonialism in certain ways. And then this is the one that we're facing.
Can you explain this Sino-British joint declaration and then subsequently the national security law from the Chinese government and how that shaped things?
Yeah, so the Sino-British Joint Declaration was a treaty signed in 1984 between the British government and the Chinese government. It was supposed to be a set of rules that governed Hong Kong's ruling after 1997, when it was supposed to be the date Hong Kong was handed back by the British government to the Chinese government. So during the negotiation, there were lots of ideas thrown into it. For example, how we can write a mini constitution that can protect Hong Kong people's freedom, that can protect Hong Kong people's way of life, and that we can have a roadmap to democracy. So all these demands were actually determined, designed before we were handed back under Chinese sovereignty. And that's exactly what the things that we've been fighting for the past years. So after that, we've got the mini constitution, basic law, and that's what evolved from it.
So this national security law was a way of squelching your rights by arguing what every dictator in the history of the world has ever argued. We have to do this for our own security. These people are terrorists, or they're secessionists, or they're going to otherwise cause problems, and we have to lock them up.
Yeah, the weaponization of national security in China has been quite prevalent. They basically put the idea of national security into everything. They have tons of sectors about national security, and the idea is that it is a very easy excuse to eradicate opposition. So I understand that there are many countries having national security law, but if we're talking about the one specifically in Hong Kong, we've had cases where people, for example, they were just waving flags, they were just speaking up for political demands, they were being involved in primary election, which in every democratic countries and every parties they would do because they wanted to get the best candidate for the election. These people are all convicted in Hong Kong. The major difference is that they have weaponized the idea of national security to the degree that even if you are not inciting violence, even if you are not upholding any terrorist thoughts, you're not trying to subvert the country, they will use it as an excuse to put democratic activists in jail. And I think that's the big difference. And in Hong Kong's national security law, they have a national security court, which the government appoints all judges, which there is no jury trial, which the law is written so vaguely. When the judges are handing out sentencing guidelines, there's basically no guidelines. It's very politically loaded and driven. So this is, I think, what makes the national security law scary. It applies to everything, that there's no standard or there's no red line Hong Kong people can follow. And people are not only terrified of doing protest or trying to confront with the police, they are even terrified with speaking up just to talk about their thoughts. So there have been a lot of interviews conducted by BBC and other news channel in Hong Kong. They were just putting the mic in front of young people or citizens, asking them, how do you feel about the national security law? How do you feel about democracy in Hong Kong. And most of the respondents shied away from answering. They were just like, no, I'm not going to talk about this.
Out of fear.
You see it in China, you see it in Russia, and now you see it in Hong Kong.
Yeah. All right, what's your story? You could have been just a young man having a good time with your friends and keep your head down, keep your mouth shut. That would be perfectly rational and reasonable. Most people do that. How come you decided to stand up and fight back?
Yeah, I also had documented it quite in quite an interesting way in my book, which I was born in a completely apolitical family. I lived in public housing. I lived in one of the most impoverished area in Hong Kong. Both my parents, they were blue collar workers. My father was a construction worker, and then my mother was a street cleaner. So basically, they didn't have much education, and I was raised not by any means to teaching me to become politicians or activists. But it was not until when I was in high school I joined my first Candle Vigilite to commemorate the fallen in the Tiananmen Square in 1989. So in 1989, there was a big democratic movement in mainland China. And one of the most iconic and brutal events was taking place on June 4th, 1989, in Tiananmen Square, when the brightest in China, when they were protesting for open government and democracy, the Beijing government and the Liberation Army rode in tanks and killed hundreds or thousands of people of them. So there were a lot of protests in Hong Kong in 1989 in support of the movement. And after that, every year, there would be a candle vigilite to commemorate these fallens. So I joined the first one when I was in high school, and I was so touched because you saw all those archive, all those videos and personal testimonies, and you saw faces that look alike. You saw people that look similar to you, and they were sacrificing, they were really throwing everything for some basic core values, which is democracy, freedom, and an open government. And it was so touching, and it really inspires me, and it was one of my political enlightenment, so that I decided to try to be involved in student movement, in activism. And then in my freshman year in college, I joined the student union as a representative of our school and student body. And then it clashed with the big era. It clashed with the umbrella movement, which was an occupation movement, hundreds of thousands of people occupying the major runways, major roads of Hong Kong in demands of democracy. And I became one of the student leader, I think most likely by coincidence. So I would say that, like, in 10 years' time, from the student leader in the umbrella movement to now talking to you, Michael, being in exile in London, there were so many unexpected turns in my life that shaped who I am. And every time I face a crossroads of life, I try to deal with it with my conscience and try to deal with it with the decisions which fit in my moral compass. And here's what those decisions led me to.
Is it just like a burning feeling inside? Like, I have to do this. This is what I have to. Something like Nelson Mandela talks about, or Dr. King. You know, he was in his 30s when he was killed. You know, all this started pretty young for a lot of the civil rights activists.
I think, first of all, starting young has its own advantage, which people always perceive youth or teenagers as innocent, as they are driven by passion and faith only, as they didn't really have much track record of being intertwined into the web of interest. So people don't really doubt your incentive. And that was what moved people, because people would love to see their leaders of being idealistic, of being really passionate, and they are acting at the interest of people, not by themselves. So that was a pretty powerful period of time of being involved in big movement like this. And for me, that was also not a calculated move. I didn't know what would happen when I throw myself for the first time in front of the police and being arrested. I didn't know what would happen when I first beaten by the baton or being pepper sprayed by them just because of we're having a peaceful rally. And many of my colleagues, many of the student activists that I worked before, they all had different roads of life. They all maybe quit after a year or two. Maybe they were so exhausted and burned out. They have different roadmaps about his life. And for a person like me who persisted for a decade constantly at the center of political storm, it is not common. I would also say that it is not something that you can intentionally designed or planned. So for me, yeah, there are lots of unexpected
Yeah, I'll say.
decisions.
How do you keep your cool when somebody throws you to the ground and starts beating you? How do you not get up and want to just fight back? Physically, I mean.
I mean, yeah, I would love to do it.
Yeah.
But, when you're in the position where people look at you and they think that you are their representative, you started thinking that way. You started to think it in terms of collective good, in terms of how you maximize your impact. So people can be very impulsive, people can be very emotional, and that is absolutely fine because you are a human being. You have your hormonal change when situation changes. But I think with years of being thrown under public gaze and limelight, I learned myself to think in a much more objective way, in a way that I can kind of think it into a collective good angle, and then try to act in accordance to that.
So it's a rational strategy.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I adopt my role, and then try not to hit back when those police were assaulting me.
Yeah, that was Dr. King's MO was he would pick the worst places to go to, where the kind of the most brutal racists in the Deep South, to do his marches and protests and walkouts and so on, because that's where you're most likely to get the kind of attention you really don't want, but you do for media coverage for your cause, to get the laws to be changed slowly but surely in this rational manner. So he had to talk to his people a lot about keeping your cool, because again, how could you not want to fight back? And that took a lot of reminding of his followers. Don't fight back. Wow. I mean, the restraint is incredible.
Yeah, of course, like people would doubt whether the non-violent strategy works. There are many components, many layers in every movement. But for me, I'm a practitioner of that, and I really do hope that my role is to kind of get that moral appeal to the people. And that is, well, I would say that I'm part of the movement, that it's just part of the strategy.
All right, then you get arrested and off to prison you go. All right, so talk about that. What was that like?
So after I was elected as the parliamentarian, as a council member in Hong Kong, and then after I was unseated, I went to jail because of my participation in the umbrella movement. It was not long. It was like 2-3 months. And I felt like I'm quite fortunate, because if I were to commit the same quote unquote crime now, it would be years of sentencing because of how bad the politics have evolved. So back then that was just like 2-3 months, and then I was in jail. And I think that it was quite, actually, when you were in it, it was quite painful. But afterwards, when you look back, you kind of feel like it taught you a lot. The experience was quite rewarding. So on the first day when I was in jail, I had to strip off all the clothes, getting checked. And then when I was completely naked, a person got next to me and he whispered in my ear and saying that, sorry, he whispered in my ear and saying that, look, I voted for you in 2016.
Whoa.
You do not belong here. You should better get out. And then I felt like, well, this is a big prison. This is an arm of the government of the incarceration. But there are actually a lot of people from different walks of life with different political opinions working here. And that was also a moment when I recognized that, well, actually, there are a lot of people supporting my work, regardless of who they are. And I think this is part of the beauty of politics. It is not only about making money, not only about manipulation of power, it's about making connection, convincing people your ideas do matter. And that was the first day. And then I would feel like when I was in prison, I was like a commodity. And then I was called by my number, and the duty of the prison guard was safely move me and the other inmates from one place to the other. So I understand that different prisons have different outlook, have different ways of operation. I heard a lot of cases of torture and physical assault in mainland China and also in Hong Kong now. But in the time of 2017 in Hong Kong, there wasn't much of that to political prisoners.
When you say it could have been much worse, you mean like these re-education camps that they send the Uyghurs to, where they're off and disappear for years on end?
Yeah, it's definitely much worse in those re-education camp, quote unquote, but actually concentration camps, a modern concentration camp for these Uyghurs. And for now, there are a lot of records of political prisoners in Hong Kong now that are being assaulted and targeted. So I would consider myself lucky to be in jail in 2017 when the politics was not as terrible as now. But nonetheless, in jail, you were trained to speak in only 3 sentences to the prison guards. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And sorry, sir. There's there's no other way that you can communicate with them. Because they are there to blunt your critical thinking, to tame you, and to make sure that you are fully under their control. So that was the experience I had in jail. And it was a time when I can really interact with people who I've never met in life. I lived in a 20 people cell. It's quite crowded. There were only like 2-3 toilets. But you get to talk to people around you. You get to talk to all those people who are drug dealers, who are gangsters, who are doing all sorts of different things, much different from what you're doing. And that's also one thing to learn about life, learn about your society, because as a representative, you're representing the city, not only the people who voted for you, but people from every corners in the city. And as long as you increase the knowledge about who they are and how their lives are, you are you're getting better as a capacity of a representative. And I think that was quite rewarding to me.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, so you get out of prison. What did you do then, and how long was it before you decided, I got to get out of this place entirely before it's too late, and you left for London or wherever you went?
Yeah, when I left jail, I went back to my study. So all the things I talked to you, Michael, it was happened. They were all happened in my undergrad life. I hadn't even graduated when I was a legislator. I didn't even graduate when I was serving time in jail. And then I felt like, look, I have to finish that. And then afterwards, I spent a year finishing my college. And then I applied for grad school in the US. And then it was 2019. It was when the big, massive anti extradition treaty movement taking place, and the whole civil society was involved. We were all there, and it was a really intense period of time.
Yeah, right. Okay, so and so you left and you went to London, and that's where you've been. Is that a safe place to be? Better than say in
Yeah,
the United States, or
yeah. So after 2019's big protest movement, where millions of Hong Kong people were marching down to the street to fight for democracy, the Hong Kong government introduced the national security law in end of June 2020, and it was the time I knew that I had to leave. The national security law was imposed by Beijing. There has never had any precedents like that before. It circumvented all the local legislation and consultation period. And even the chief executive by then, the leader of Hong Kong, she said that she didn't know the articles and the contents of the national security law until it was publicized. So you would say that like a big law that really changed Hong Kong, imposed to the city without anyone in the city knowing it. And that was how intense it was. So before a few days it was enacted, we read from news, speculation of how draconian it would be. And then I felt like if I were to stay in Hong Kong, I would definitely be arrested because of that, because of my track record as being one of the most high-profile opposition leader, doing a lot of international advocacy work. By then, I was already having a lot of trips to the Congress and to the White House to try to urge the US to pass laws and then meeting important politicians. And then I've been advocating for more accountability to the Chinese regime and more attention to the human rights abuses in the region. So I knew that I would be targeted. So I left Hong Kong a few days before it was enacted. It was also quite nervous because I didn't know that whether I was in a blacklist. So I went to the airport, I had the ticket, I went through the gate, and then there was only my backpack and hand carry luggage because I didn't want to bring anything that would trouble me when I was arrested there. And I emptied all my electronic devices, I deleted everything, and then I was waiting to be boarded. And I finally got on the plane, and then the plane took off. And that was the time I really had the energy of processing how life would be outside of Hong Kong.
Must have been a huge relief when those wheels went up into the wheel wells and you're like, okay, I'm off the ground, I'm out of here.
Yeah, it was a huge relief, but at the same time, it was a sense of helpless because you felt like you were uprooted. You felt like you've dedicated your life and putting your life at risk for years for this city, and then you are saying a seemingly eternal goodbye to it. And that was the time when you realized that, well, you were so nervous about whether you could get out, and for now you have already gotten out, and you have to think ahead. You have to plan. And that was the fear of uncertainty, the fear of future floating into your mind. And to be honest, I was pretty much the first one who were really high profile leaving Hong Kong in 2020. So before that, there were a few of the others who did the same thing. But I was arguably the most high-profile one in 2020 and the first one to do that. For me, it was also an uncharted territory. I didn't know how a life of exile would be in 2020. It was so different from 1989, when there were a large group of Chinese dissidents left China and then started a new life in other countries. So for me, it was a really mixed feeling. It was wow, I think I'm safe now, but also there's a very nebulous future ahead.
Remember when General Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines after the Japanese invaded, and he said, "I shall return," and he did. Of course, he had the backing of the United States military, which is not trivial. How does one guy like you going to reform your home from this massive billion-strong then dictator, Xi Jinping, short of him just dying and somebody new coming into power that's more like a Gorbachev. How are you going to do this?
The answer is I can't. This is not like a heroic Hollywood movie where one man can save the world. For me, I've always think of myself as someone trying to do the best in the position that I can contribute. I used to be a student leader, and then I was a legislator, and then I was an inmate. And then for now, I'm an exile leader. In every stage of life, it requires different skill set. And it has always to be a team effort of how we can achieve things. So for now, my duty is to do awareness raising work, grow our Hong Kong exile community, make sure that it is still relevant, the Hong Kong issue is still relevant, and amplify the voice of Hong Kong. There are lots of the other things I'm able to do. For example, doing underground organizational work in Hong Kong, trying to test the boundary, trying to get people together in Hong Kong. And I know that, so I've always told myself that as long as I am doing my part, then that's fine. Like a historical change requires a lot of components. It requires not only the effort of the people, but also how the world changes is also a key element, and how countries interact, what's happening in global politics. And there are a lot of things about Hong Kong that I have no control of. So it is an old idiom, but we all say that democratic movement is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And you have to be patient.
Yeah. And one person can make a difference. You just never know. So you have to keep pressing forward. Okay, and I know your book is not a work of political philosophy, but let's talk about some of your inspirational passages and what's behind them. Freedom is our most fundamental human right. It is universal to us all. If the right to life is our right to exist, our right to be free allows us to live the only life worth living. We all need our own agency, freedom of thought, and conscience. Without these, we have no dignity. All right, very inspirational. Where do rights come from? Where does freedom come from? How do you define those and so forth?
Well, of course, it will be a long, like, political philosophical discussion. But for me, there's a chapter in the book saying that political freedom manifests in opposition. So this is a very specific scenario that I'm talking about. So, for example, the Chinese government always says that they have freedom. The Chinese people have freedom. You have freedom to praise the government. You have freedom to talk about how good Xi Jinping is. And you have 1,000 TV channels in mainland China. There's so much that you have difficulty to choose which one to look at. But they're all playing the same news. Is that freedom of choice? Is that freedom of speech? And if you go on to Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, and then you say anything about Winnie the Pooh, which is a lookalike of Xi Jinping, and then when you say anything about the Tiananmen massacre, and we have also an idiom in China saying that you can enjoy your freedom of speech, but only once, because after that, you'll be disappeared. And that is what I assess. This is how I assess whether you've got the true freedom, which is whether you have the freedom to challenge the power, whether you have the freedom to oppose, whether you have the freedom to really create an option or something that's different. And that is the key of how I narrate the way the Chinese politics works and the way that Hong Kong politics used to work. And I think, the same thing can also apply to whether when we say that we have a diversified opinion, or when we have a lot of different sources of information, but are they really that different? Are we also making a conscious choice when we choose to read from different angle? I think that is something I wanted to convey in my book.
Yeah, you did, especially through the Orwell quote. Let's see here. Hang on. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear.
Yeah,
that's not going to happen in China. You could do it once.
Yeah, you can. You have freedom of speech, but only once.
Yeah. Here's another thing you wrote here. I think freedom is as much a gut feeling as a thought, as much a cause of the heart as of the head. What drives their pursuit of freedom is not only the ideal, but also their revulsion against the opposite, to be unfree. It is their sense of being oppressed, of witnessing or experiencing injustice and unfairness that is the driver. This reminds me a little bit of I don't know if you're familiar with the negativity bias. There's a famous paper called Why Bad is Stronger Than Good. And it kind of derives from a bunch of different psychological studies. One is called loss aversion in behavioral economics. Losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. So if you want to get somebody to invest in a business thing or something, you got to make it look like the profits are going to be roughly double what the losses would hurt the person. And there's a bunch of studies on this about how we have more adjectives for painful things than pleasurable things. Bad things that happen last longer in memory than good things. A bad incident in a day will carry over to the next day, whereas something good that happens doesn't carry over the next day, and so on. And so it just goes on. And the reason behind it seems to be that there's just more ways for things to go wrong than to go well. And so we evolved cognition to be highly sensitive to bad things happening to us. So I think that's what you're describing, something like that. You get, here I'm in the United States, in California, I'm free, whatever. I hardly even think about it. But I would think about it a lot if all of a sudden some of the things started to be taken away. It's the being taken away that you notice it. When you have it, you don't really notice it.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put on how Hong Kong people feel when they saw their rights and freedom being taken away. As I said, Hong Kong people never ask for things that are imaginary, that never existed. They were asking Beijing to fulfill their promises because they felt like they own the promises. So if you deny it, it's a sense of loss. It's a sense of betrayal. And on top of that, you got situations like they're also taking away your freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the political rights. They are rewriting the whole election so that your participation doesn't matter. And that really caused an explosion of anger and the pursuit for freedom of Hong Kong. So yes, indeed, in Hong Kong stories, it really reflects when you are asking for things that you're promised and you think you are in possession of, is much stronger than you're asking something that is out of the blue.
There's a famous quote from Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, that rights is nonsense and natural rights is nonsense on stilts. What he meant is, where am I going to find these rights out in nature? I look around, I don't see any rights. They're just a political contract. Without a government with a gun and military and police to protect your rights, you don't have rights. Okay, so I get that. And, there's this is-ought wall supposedly separating facts from values, which I'm not comfortable with, because I think a lot of what you talk about, particularly in that previous passage about how it being a feeling that people have, it seems to me people do have an innate desire for freedom. And we know that by just looking at what people do given the choice. Would you rather live in East Berlin or West Berlin, or East Germany and West Germany before the unification? Well, they had to put up a wall to answer that question, because they know how people would vote. Would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? Of course, we know the answer to that. Short of people being brainwashed or controlled, people vote with their feet, and that's telling us something about human nature, I think.
Yeah, that's what I wrote in the book. So people ask me, how can you be hopeful about the future of Hong Kong and future of China? Because the current situation is so stark. It is seemingly hopeless. But for me, that's not like a calculated question. It is because I believe in the innate nature of people fighting and striving for freedom. And then I believe in the human capacity, their agency, and the cycle of social movement. So I have these not calculated hope that I would think that things could change in the future, but it just takes time and takes effort. And every one of us who are in position of making a change should be well prepared and should improve ourselves and should be the best form of ourselves. And that's how I approach the situation of Hong Kong. I do feel like I'm not an optimistic person in general. I'm quite pessimistic, and I'm
really.
Quite
I don't get that from your book.
to the situation, but I also feel like it's even more stupid to be hopeless. You can have reality check all the time. You can have a realistic outlook and assessment, but you should never lose hope.
I like that. Here's another passage from your book. Freedom should be the starting point for our relationships with others. To form and maintain these relationships, we often choose to curtail our freedoms. We may relinquish a certain amount of freedom in return for collective benefits. For instance, I'm happy to give up some of my income taxes so I don't have to build my own roads or hospitals. Yes. We cede certain rights to government on the condition that it provides us with an environment in which we can live and hopefully prosper. This relationship between freedom and obedience is the basis of the social contract. Okay, there's some good political philosophy there. I guess so here's the question. Once you move away from the far wall of autocracy on one side and total anarcho-capitalism on the other side, I guess the question is then becomes, to what extent do we need government for collective action problems like roads or the internet or the electrification of a nation or whatever, versus, lockdowns, mass mandates, things like that happen, which now looking back feels a little too draconian, even in Western countries. Like the government got too powerful there. We don't want that to happen again.
Well, I think the big nature of politics is very local, is very contextualized. So one thing in Hong Kong may not apply to the one thing in California. And take the COVID lockdown as an example. In Hong Kong, it was also one of the most draconian COVID measure place where at the end of that kind of lockdown, everyone's so upset. They didn't really know why Hong Kong had to be in lockdown for a long period of time, apart from the fact that they have to benchmark with mainland China. But they have two different contexts. Like in Hong Kong, we rely on our international feature to thrive. We rely on opening up the city. We rely on foreigners, investment, visitors. We rely on professional services provide to the rest of the world. And we have a larger need to get off lockdown than in mainland China. And I think these policies should be adopted in accordance to local needs. But that was not the case because I think it was also politically driven policy by the Hong Kong government, which they didn't want to do anything violating the kind of nationwide policy from mainland China. So they waited and waited. That was one of the example. And I don't really have a clear answer of how big a government should be. But I do think that is definitely something up for discussion. It's not a taboo. Is not something like if you are advocating for small government, then you must be some crazy capitalist, or if you are thinking that there should be more benefit, then you are an anarchist. One thing that I don't like in political debate is that we are too comfortable in demonizing the others. We're comfortable to drawing extreme and labels to the others, so that we can actually be lazy and not to talk about concrete policies and concrete change. It's easy to point fingers. It's easy to say that you are demons so that you're wrong. But I think we need more discussion on all fronts, and we need more discussion so that we can have a much more sophisticated understanding of our current situation in order to break these vicious cycles.
Yeah. Okay, if you were Prime Minister of the UK or President of the United States or whatever, what about economic sanctions against China for various civil rights violations? Or if you were an NBA coach or manager, you wrote about this. I think it was the Houston Rockets, was it, who spoke out about the Uyghurs, and then he got slapped on the wrist and had to apologize because the NBA makes so much money. I get that. Elon wants to sell Teslas in China. Please, U.S. government, don't go over there and make too much trouble, right? So where's the balance there?
Well, I mean, so first of all, we must defend some of our moral principles, right? No forced labor, and no products from concentration camps, no kind of economic rewards, even though they're doing terrible human rights violations. I think we can start from there, because I understand that in today's globalized world, economy and trades are so intertwined. It is merely impossible to just cut all ties and then pretend each other doesn't exist. But I think one plight that we are having now is that democracy is losing ground in terms of a moral appeal, in terms of whether this is the right system, whether we have the capacity to convince the world that democracies are going to benefit the people and being in a moral leadership of the world. So I think that really correlates to how we deal with authoritarian country, and the most stark threat in the world, apart from the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, that is China, because they are also actively supporting Russia. They're actively supporting different authoritarian powers in the world, and they are so intertwined with all the West economy, so that it makes us difficult to act swiftly. But I think we got to change. We got to change our attitude. We got to change our system, and we got to see it as a big threat. I think the policies on putting a lot more restriction on is cutting edge technology, trying to compete with them, trying to make sure that we're not giving them any praises in terms of giving them legitimacy. I think all these things are really important in the way that we deal with them. And take the NBA as an example. Like there was a NBA coach criticizing China, and then China really cancels the whole NBA live stream and then make a big fuss of it. It's quite unfair to just ask NBA to go against the whole country. At that moment, should the US government help them a little bit? Should there be a collective response? That a few years back, Australia was criticizing China's handling of COVID, so that China imposed a lot of tariff on many of its goods. Should there be a collective response from the West that they have to protect their outspoken ally, that they also have to adopt economic policy so that to make a level playing field, whether they should also get more support to the countries that are being economically sanctioned by China just because they say things that we do say. I think there are a lot more ways to help each other than we are currently adopting or even imagining. So I think, like, I'm not saying that we should think of a blanket policy that we would cut all ties, but there are definitely a lot of nuances that we can utilize to just step by step building our resilience and helping each other out.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen with Taiwan?
Taiwan, there has been a dark cloud looming above it. So the so-called peaceful reunification is over. There's no way that we can imagine a future where Taiwanese people are willingly or willfully admit themselves as part of the PRC. Whether there will be military invasion, I don't think anyone has a concrete answer. We only know that, first of all, Xi Jinping has the incentive to do it. The way that it narrates is historical responsibility, which is a rejuvenation of the century of failure in mainland China. It encompasses the components of getting Taiwan back. So in its core political philosophy narrative, which is also written in the Chinese constitution, there is a responsibility for Xi Jinping to complete that mission of so-called reunification of Taiwan. But of course, we also have seen a lot of signs that are bad for China. For example, the economy is doing poorly, and it doesn't really give more incentive to have another war. And China is, for now, is trying to repair the relationship with Europe at least, and trying to gain more allies on the international stage. Having other warfare doesn't really benefit that goal. So I think the situation is quite dynamic. But at the end of the day, it's dangerous because China under Xi Jinping's ruling has evolved from a more like collective authoritarian leadership to a one-man dictatorship. And that's dangerous because that person could think in a crazy way. Like if you have like 10 people in the Politburo and then they try to check each other out, then probably a crazy idea doesn't really realize. But if there's one man making a decision, that it could happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point of not having a dictator. But they do seem to like each other. It's weird. Although I think Xi Jinping has Putin under his thumb, more or less, economically, if not militarily. So I don't think we're going to have nuclear war or anything like that. I don't think the Chinese would allow that. But what's the infatuation with Kim Jong-un and North Korea? It's like a satellite state for the Chinese?
Well, definitely. I think the way that Xi Jinping supports Kim Jong-un and Putin is to strengthen the allies of dictatorships, right? It is at the end of the day and also an ideological war. Like no matter how much China brands itself as democracy, as a free country, they know that they are in a dictatorship and they need help from the other dictators. So that's the baseline of their relationship. I'm not sure what Kim Jong-un is thinking. The country is so close, there's not much information they can read from on the newspaper. But I think Xi Jinping has the incentive to destabilize these regions because it shifted attention away from him. So if you look at when the Ukraine war took place, before that, the world was really critical to the PRC. They were putting a lot of pressure to Xi Jinping. But after that, the world shifted attention. So I guess even if like North Korea is not a client state or whatsoever, I think for China there's a kind of benefit when these regions are destabilized, and then China can also have more control over them, just like what Russia has evolved for the past 2 years. They become much more reliant to China, and China's taking them into their pocket. So I guess there's an incentive for Xi Jinping to see the world in a messy place.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out in 2027 when the big show is supposed to happen there in Taiwan. We'll see.
Mm.
Do you still have family in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I still do have. So last year there was a big harassment to my family. A group of police raided my family home and then took my mom and my brother into questioning for hours. And then they also arrested some of my former colleagues who the police put up a false accusations of them helping me out, even if they're in Hong Kong. So yeah, there are lots of things like this, a lot of harassment, a lot of collective punishment. And that's the reason why I actually cannot talk too much of it, because I also don't know much of it.
Wow. Do you have a desire to get them out, get them over to London, or is that out of the question?
Yeah, for now it's so even if I have to say I don't have it on the show.
Yeah.
And if I don't have it, then properly I would say I don't have it. So either way, you get the same
Got
answer.
it. Yeah, sure. Okay, I got it. All right, Nathan, it's late there in London. I know you're only what 31. You have
30,
your
yeah,
you have
30
your
to
whole. You're
31.
just starting off. Oh my God, young man, what are you going to do next? What's on the agenda here? More
Yeah,
books, talks, conferences. What you travel a lot?
I have the new edition of the book coming out, which will be released at the end of June. It is under Penguin Random House. It is paperback, Freedom, How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. It's been having a really magnificent reception. So I really do
Nice.
hope that it is people will read it as an introductory book to Hong Kong's democratic movement through my lens. So this is one thing, and then I have an other Chinese book coming out in Taiwan in summer, which I will travel to Taiwan to get some talks and just to promote the book. That's a book that documents my life from 2019 to 2023, and also a group of my a lot of my political commentaries are also included in the book. And apart from that, there are also a lot of activities in the Hong Kong community, and also probably documentaries coming out in the US. And I don't have the dates now, but let's see. I think everyone can watch it afterwards.
Nice. They should take some of those quotes from the book, some of the ones I read, put them on little leaflets, and then drop leaflets over cities in China, like they used to do in the 1950s.
Yeah.
What could go wrong? Oh my God! Anybody that would pick them up and read them would be in trouble, probably. Don't
Yeah,
they have
they'll
like
definitely be in
200 million
trouble.
cameras there following every single person who does anything?
Yeah, it's a big surveillance country now.
Unbelievable. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
scary. Orwellian.
Well, Orwellian is an understatement when you
Yeah.
compare it to China now.
I was reading some. One of my guests was telling me about like AI software that can take like the eye glaze and facial expression of somebody who's reading like the equivalent of Chairman Mao's little red book, whatever Xi Jinping has, and to see if they're actually reading it or if they're like paying attention or not, and then punish them if they're not. Yeah, I mean, have you heard this? This is crazy.
Yeah, there are, I think there are some clips and news circulating online a couple months ago or a year or two saying that there are classroom equipping with these AI camera that they can read your facial expression and then give an index of your emotion. For example, you look at a book, whether you're happy, whether you're angry, whether you're upset.
Roll your eyes.
Yeah. And then you can definitely use it to kind of test these students or these individuals in workplace. And then they also have a set of cameras, which is also using these AI tools and algorithm to just identify people by how they walk. So when it was in the COVID time, people were masses. It's difficult to tell who they are with facial recognition, and then they come up with the kind of detection with walking gesture, and those things really show how scary a surveillance state could be. And I think the Orwellian state depicted in the book 1984 is an understatement.
Yeah.
He wasn't able to grasp how things changed and how much these technology are going to be applied in the country.
Did you ever see that documentary? I think it was called Other People's Lives or Other Lives or something like that, about the East German Stasi. And it was something like a third of all citizens were spies for the government on each other, basically, because pretty much everybody that you know is going to be in that web.
Yeah, I read books about it. It's a terrible thing, and I think the closest that we can get for now is a lot of overseas Chinese students' body. They also have a serious problem of spying, of monitoring, because these students, some of them, even though they were not sent by the Chinese government can request them to work for the regime on the basis that they can revoke their visa, or they can give pressure to their families in mainland China, or give them incentive of like having good prospects when they go back to mainland China. So yeah, those I've talked to so many Chinese students. They also have the same worry and fear, which even though they're not in mainland China, but the surveillance and spying are ubiquitous. They're not really escaping from it.
Astonishing anybody thinks this is a good idea, but obviously some people do. The ones that have power anyway can do something about it. All right, Nathan, good luck to you on your work. If there's anything I can do to help, if you want Space and Skeptic magazine to publish essays or articles about any of this stuff, you have an open invitation. Whatever we can do to help.
Michael.
All right, Nathan.